87% of cancers are environmentally caused, not related. And I learned that in the course of this work. That's a horrible statistic. If ever there was a reason to regulate the environment, because environmental health is what should drive environmental regulation, and environmental health is part of public health. And PFAS connects to climate change because they are a huge contributor, one of the largest, to ozone depletion. It all connects.
Hi, welcome to the second edition of my latest production. It is Code Green, Conversations for the Future We Want and Our Kids Deserve. I am thrilled, honored, and verklempt to have my latest Shiro on to have a discussion about her Goldman Prize award. Laurene Allen was one of six Goldman Prize winners, and I believe there's always one American each year. I've been going to them for about 10 years. And you are one heck of a Erin Brockovich mama bear. So without further ado, first of all, congratulations. It's
Thank
just
you.
so inspiring, especially for, those of us who have worked in the environmental climate, environmental health community for so long and feel, like the deck is stacked against us. And we certainly feel like it's a mountain now, not a deck, to see what one person can accomplish. And I want to just let our listeners know that, and viewers, that you are really a one-woman organizer extraordinaire. Just a little bit of background. This is about PFAS and PFOAs, and I'm going to let you pronounce the actual 3 or 4 words that are behind that. I won't try. And I saw Dark Water. I saw a lot of, and I think there was another film at Sundance a couple of years ago about the same issue. Maybe it was Dark Waters, like blurs. Uh,
The devil you know is the other one.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes. And
both.
I figured PFOs must be illegal by now. And I'm still not clear. And don't let me forget to ask you, are any kind of anti-stick frying pans safe or not? I still don't know that. And I'm an environmentalist, and I don't think maybe if I did a really deep dive research project, I'd find out, but you'd be the person to tell us. So tell us first, I love your origin story, if you will, when you were not even a mere teenager, 12, I think is the story. You found a book written by somebody who really is the original Shiro, environmental hero, and pick up the story from there and then skip forward a few decades. Tell us what you do now. I think you're a clinical social worker, which is what my daughter does.
Oh,
Uh,
wonderful.
that's not easy either, but it's nothing compared to what you have been fighting.
But it's
And
a good perspective. Yeah.
I'll give the headline so nobody dare tune out. You led a campaign that successfully not only forced a plastics POA, PFOA factory to become more stringent about their effluent, their pollution,
Mhm.
their chemicals that were poisoning your community, but they shut down because of your efforts and the people who believed you when the official word was no problem, just like after 9/11. No, it's safe.
Oh.
Yeah. So tell us what happened at that garage sale a few decades ago.
Well, I grew up in Massachusetts and I love the outdoors. I was, looking at tadpoles in brooks in the morning and going through fields and woods in the afternoon. And we went to a yard sale, and I probably had no more than $1 if I had that in those days, definitely
And
probably
further
not
back then.
early
Yeah.
70s. A nickel went a long way. So I found Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and I bought it for, I don't, under 25 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents. And I said, oh, wow, Silent Spring. I looked at it. I was thinking about water and brooks that I loved. And then I took it home and I read that book, and I was just wowed. And I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible. This is horrible. What does this mean to all this? So I was talking to people about that as a kid, and a lot of the adults didn't know what I was talking about. I kept that book. I just kept that book forever. I raised my kids with awareness of that book. And that little did I know at 12 that that really was a real immense beginning of an environmental movement that a female scientist had kind of, blown the whistle on and sounded the alarms. At that time in the early 70s, I remember the enactment of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the cleanup of Boston Harbor. I lived, outside of Boston in the western suburbs, and I remember feeling all the things going on in the 70s. Now, there were some bad things going on with wars and things, but overall, from an environmental perspective, I was so happy and I was so proud of our nation at that point.
And some of
So
it was done under President Nixon. Strange.
Yes,
But
yes, yes. And Reagan did some work on environmental things when he came along. Didn't agree with economic policy personally, but for environmental things, there are people who really understand this and who they appoint to the EPA really matters.
but
So
he had that
1985,
solar panel taken off the White House roof that Carter had put on. That's when I said, I mean, why?
right.
You know,
Yeah, why?
so
Why?
that says where he and too many other Republicans really stand. But I digress. Take us
Yeah.
now, fast forward to
So
Mary,
I
New
come up to
Hampshire.
1985. I'd been living in Mass. We were thinking about, where do we want to live when we have a family? And we looked at, we want good schools, we want nature outside, we want safety, we want clean air, clean water, less of the rat race. I'm an hour outside of Boston without traffic, but it's a whole different world here in southern New Hampshire. So this really checked all the boxes. So we moved to this, house on a cul-de-sac where it's quiet, no shades on the windows because you don't need them. Mama bear and babies can walk through your yard in the spring when they come out. They don't bother you.
Real mama
Yeah,
bears,
absolutely. Black bears, not grizzlies.
four-legged kind.
Yeah, but the black bears they're not a problem here. And
You're,
everybody knows
you're
when you hear
mama bear.
bird feeders, don't feed them and you're all good. Wild turkeys, the most dangerous animal in this area would be a skunk that you weren't aware of. And then you're like, no, call your dog. Get back.
But,
So
but you're mama bear and you're kind of dangerous too in your own wonderful
oh
way.
yeah, yeah. But again, you can be peacefully, enjoying the outdoors, or you can alert, lock on target mode if you need to. Absolutely. So, kids come along in 87 and 90, and the water here is groundwater based. Everything looks so beautiful and pristine. There's conservation trails and waterways and brooks and rivers and waterfalls, and just the ultimate place to raise a family. And there we are toddling along and we're drinking water from the tap. When I raised my kids, I was very aware of plastics. I was aware of Teflon pans and didn't use them. And just as an aside, ceramic cookware, if you must use nonstick, ceramic cookware is what you want to look for. A green pan is affordable, and that is the brand. No Tefal.
Thank
Tefal is bad news.
you.
Bad
Thank
news.
you. So even if it says PFO or POA free, that
Right.
mean you can
Yes.
buy it and be safe.
There's
Okay.
cookware out there there's two schools of cookware. One school is doing it correct and it's ceramic technology and it's really PFAS free. And PFAS is a whole category of chemicals. There are fluorinated chemicals, the non-stick, water repelling, oil repelling, grease resistant. So basically, then you'll see something else that says PFOA free or PFOS free. And then you have to look and see what it is. So there's a strain of pans out there that are using something called PTFE, and they're starting to claim that it isn't PFAS. It is. That's what my polluter spewed on us. PTFE is Teflon. So they're just really bold. In Tefal, right? Tefal pans, you get a whole set of them for a pretty affordable price point. How many people have those? And they're bad news. And we have to pressure those manufacturers to pivot and use ceramic nonstick. That will be
It's
safe.
like how are they allowed to sell Roundup in this country when people have gotten sick when they're
Oh
in
my gosh, pesticides and weed killers and well,
and
look at the food chain. Look at what farmers were sold a bill of goods, right?
doesn't
Yeah,
happen in Europe, only in
I know.
America. Yeah.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So here we are, kids come along. As they grew up, we're a town that has the New England Fourth of July parade with the fire trucks and the marching bands and the whole bit. And every year a float would be in the parade of Merrimack Village District, which is our water department. And they would be down there with the float with their banner on the side. And, the kids are waiting to see who's throwing out candy and they're doing the curb scrambling, who can get the most candy. They would throw water bottles out, and the bottles would say on the label for years, best tasting water in New Hampshire. And they were awarded year after year after year. So if ever there was assurance of safety, we were proud of that. The water tasted good, looked good, smelled good, and it's groundwater. So you're thinking it's not going to be impacted as surface water would be, because surface water can be problematic and for runoff, and we know this. So, when this happened, I just thought, oh my gosh, the best tasting water in New Hampshire. How could this be? Because these are tasteless, odorless, invisible, and highly toxic
okay.
substances. I mean, what a head game is that? And to think that there were no laws preventing this from happening. So the water was freely. We used it, we filled up flasks, stainless steel. The kids went to school. They refilled that at water bubblers. They filled up at the dance school. They filled up at marching band practice. We drank water. I irrigated 8 raised beds that I believed was an organic garden. There was no sprays, no powdering. We handpicked cucumber beetles, to make sure nobody was gonna put the nasty powder that kills the beetles on my cucumbers. And little did we know, So the other thing is we're raining down from the air and precipitation, air emissions, and air particulate deposition from this factory in the northeast corner of town it's going for miles and miles and miles. So when this broke, I didn't garden. I did not garden that year. And I said, that's it. Those raised beds are not organic and we can't do that. And we were watering them from an outside spigot that was tap water.
I know this is kind of a detailed question. I'm just curious, how is it that these really bad chemicals, forever chemicals, can be neutralized? Do they have to put other chemicals in to make it so you don't taste it and you don't smell it? Because it's hard to imagine, these
No,
chemicals
it's
not
just
having
the nature of
odor.
them. It's a bond it goes back to the Manhattan Project where it was accidentally discovered and they used it. It was there's a lot written on this where is this partnership between the Department of Defense and private industry that was racing to help. And it was all Manhattan Project under the umbrella of that originally, and then it went from there. Then they decided, ooh, we could do things, with this, and we could market it, and we could put it in this, and we could put it in that, and we could make Scotchgard, right? And who didn't remember Stainmaster carpets when they were growing up, right? And the mothers were happy because
Laying it
they
all
weren't
over our new
rubbing
sofas.
stains.
If anybody spills orange juice,
Yep, and
oh,
kids buying new sneakers, right? And wanting those sneakers to look good. And my husband would take them downstairs and put them on his workbench in the basement and spray them with Scotchgard. And whenever I found out about it, they'd be like, Dad, Mom says to do that outside. So I'd be like, you can't do that inside. You shouldn't be breathing aerosols, right? And who knows what's in that stuff. But I didn't think that there it is on their clothing and shoes where they're dermally absorbing this, right? Little did I know, he's taking big Coleman jugs to work every day of tap water, to consume. And
and thinking that's a healthy thing. We're supposed to drink
yeah,
more water. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, when we don't trust the water is when it's iron colored and smelly and sulfury and looks like I don't want to take a bath in that water, right? Also, you're cooking pasta, rice, corn, making tea. I drank a lot of tea. He drank coffee, and you're boiling doesn't help. It further concentrates the chemicals. So what an invention, was this? And it evaded toxic chemical designation for decades to the point that maybe somebody thought, uh-oh, we can't let them know now because there's too much liability. So they told people after the fact that they voluntarily phased them out, but they didn't tell anyone what they phased in their place, which is more of the same chemical class, just reformulated and just as toxic.
Sort of what happened with BPA. BPA free.
Absolutely.
What did they do
Yes,
to replace
exactly.
that? And
And the
and
best way to think of what we should have here is with PCBs, class regulation. This should be class regulation. It should be counted as total organic fluorines. It would be much cheaper in research and development and testing because you would just test for total organic fluorines. That will signal PFAS is there. Why is there so much resistance to that? Because they want to pretend that the reformulations are safe, and they're not.
okay, so what led you to lead this campaign that ultimately was successful beyond maybe your dreams? Or what was your goal? What did you think you
Yeah.
could accomplish?
Oh my gosh. If I had known, 9 years later, I still would be doing this in addition to life and a full-time job. I mean, I don't think you think when you're in a situation where you say, I need to do something. No one's coming to save us. And there are a lot of people here who get it in this town. So we need to mobilize. So we heard in 2016 that they were, quote, relatively low levels, is what they told us, in the water supply. And it was only 2 of our 6 public wells, but don't worry, we closed them. And now we're investigating. And they said only about 13 private wells because New Hampshire has quite a lot of private wells. And groundwater is groundwater. If it's a public well, if it's a private well, it's the same aquifer. So closer to St. Gobain, they had a small amount of wells in Northeast Merrimack, so the story goes. And at this information meeting, even told at that beginning that it was a very restricted area, people were going up to this microphone to ask questions. Usually they would ask about, what are you going to do about this? We better not be paying. Oh, are they going to pay our water bills? Because everybody's about the money and not paying any more taxes than they have to in New Hampshire. Not everybody, but the original, New Englanders are like that. So people are going up there and they're self-disclosing. Stoic, diehard New Englanders who are older males who, when you say, how are you doing? They say fine. They could be end stage and they tell you they're fine and they keep going. They do not self-disclose, right? I'm married to a New England dieharder. I'm a first generation New England. He goes way back to Maine roots and he's fine, he's good. And you're going, well, what are you taking that antibiotic for? Oh, it's nothing, or whatever it is. He's always fine. So these men are disclosing cancers that they've struggled with. One had lost his wife who had two rounds of kidney cancer that was, lymphomas. Son was thyroid removed at age 14. And they're telling this story about their whole household. And they're saying, could it be the water? So their voice is soft and their voice is really hesitant because they've never spoke this way ever. And they're up in front of a massive crowd at a microphone, but they felt compelled to ask because as they listened to this, they weren't hearing two wells closed on this end of town in 13 wells. It would be easy to say, oh, phew, that's not my neighborhood, because people do that. People do that. Instead, their brain said, could this be why? And those were the questions they were asking. There was one man, 30 something, who came up and he said, my wife is pregnant with her first child, and should she be drinking this water? He wasn't told to use a precautionary principle. He was told the water was safe and she could drink it. I, at that point, said, wait a minute. So, this is what I'm thinking when I heard that answer. I'm thinking in 1986, November, I found out I'm pregnant with my first child. My first question to my OBGYN, because you don't know you're pregnant for a few weeks, I go in and I say, I drink Diet Coke every day. Is aspartame safe for a growing fetus? He says, we don't really know, but you might want to stop because when we find out someday, you wouldn't feel real good about knowing that it wasn't a good decision. And I said, yeah, I should stop. And that was it. No Diet Coke. So I took one for the team and I knew because if you don't know, doesn't mean it's safe. So they're saying we don't know much about them. These are emerging contaminants. For goodness sakes, they've been around for decades. And there's no human health science. I'm Googling my phone and I'm finding the C8 study, which they talked about in Dark Waters and The Devil We Know, with 80,000 participants. And they're ignoring that. And it definitively links at least some of the health conditions, not all. And, we don't really know. And there's no way to, connect exposure to outcome. So it felt like to me like somebody was being protected. And I couldn't say that aloud, but my instinct was saying something is not right here. And the slides that they presented about these were really lacking. So while you're telling people you don't really know and you can't really say, you're also assuring them that the water is safe. So if you don't know, you don't tell people the water is safe, right? So it was, and they're cooperating with the investigation and they're praising them for being good neighbors. It was kind of weird. And people were asking questions about, taking baths and showers and filling their swimming pools with water. Oh, nope, no problem. Go ahead and do it. And I'm thinking,
People want to believe that, right? They want to think that,
well, people were kind of like,
but
what's going on? So the slides
connected
they
us. You
presented,
connected us, yeah.
yeah. So the slides were, something about those slides was bothering me and I didn't know what it was. And a few days later, my brain was continuing to think about this. And I said, wait a second, the investigation slides that they presented had the seal of the state of New Hampshire on them. Those slides didn't have that. There was something down in the lower right corner. What was that? So I go online to the state site, or the video, I don't remember which. I open up, the picture, I enlarge it, and I see the 3M logo on the slides that they presented us.
Okay.
And then by then, so 3 days after this presentation, I didn't know it when I saw it, but 3 days later, I now know 3M is the maker of PFOA because you go and you Google PFOA and you Google PFOA and thyroid and you find scads of information. Everything I heard a person say that they wondered about, I looked up kidney impacts. Number one, kidney cancer with PFOA, kidney, thyroid, liver, on and on and on it goes. So I'm thinking, this is horrible. And what I'm seeing is humans that are walking away from the mic looking really broken and really depleted. And, my clinical hat is on, which I didn't realize, because everybody at this meeting is thinking, oh my God, what does this mean to me and my family and my neighbors? I didn't realize that I had shifted into when I'm in my office clinically, I'm not in the equation. My family is not in my office. I am there for whatever system is in front of me. So I was watching, observing, and that part of my brain kicked in and I didn't even know it. So through the years, most of the story that I tell, where a lot of activists that I know on PFAS are telling their family stories, their personal stories, I have been the one to really consistently tell the community story and what I've heard and who's come to me and patterns that I see in streets, including my own. And I'm used to protecting my family's privacy. And I am in the public eye in my clinical practice because I own the practice. It's only 15 minutes away from my house. And I was like, I don't really want present and future clients coming in and saying, are you okay? Is your family okay? That wasn't okay. So it was, that was easy for me to, you know, act in that way. But, you know, I realized these people were so broken that they weren't getting any answers and they deserved answers. Now, there isn't a state or government anywhere in the world that's going to look somebody in the eye and say, yes, it was the water. I'm not naive, but they could have done a better job. I reached out to the federal government and I said, what guidance do you have? Because this was absolutely not okay. Can you give guidance to our state so they can better support us? They said, we have the guidance. Here it is. We'll send it to you. And then they said, well, you can't share it. So I guess it wasn't something the public typically gets, but somehow they wanted to give it to me. And they did. And I brought it to the state. And I said, gee, I know this is new to you. Maybe you didn't realize that this was here. Come on. It's the state of New Hampshire. And then, thank you. Oh, well, and they're thinking, oh, what do we say about this? So, there were a lot of pieces that I was trying to like get them to do a better job in addition to supporting people who weren't being supported. And then people started calling me and I paid home visits and listened to their stories. And what I realized there that I know already from the clinical work I do, when someone comes in for counseling and therapy and they have a trauma story, right? And they first develop trust and tell that to a therapist, they leave and they feel better. Now, what changed in their life? Absolutely nothing. And it's not a placebo effect. What changed is they are no longer alone in their nightmare and they were validated. Now, validation isn't enough when you heal people with trauma, but it's a huge part of therapy. And people were being validated and they trusted me. And I kept, sometimes they'd say, I want you to tell my story when you go to this meeting with the EPA. Here's pictures of my cancers. Here's pictures of my child in cancer treatment. I mean, they're giving me pictures and they're basically telling me, you tell my story because they can't. It's too emotional. So I did, everywhere, everywhere. These are families in my community. We gathered health data. And then I realized on social media, in meetings, people were in a tizzy. They were angry, they were emotional. You owe us this. How dare you? Who's going to do something about this? That doesn't get the job done. I was thinking back to my training in the beginning as a social worker and macro and policy work that I did, which really talked about problem consensus and stakeholder analysis. And a community has to be on board with the problem, the solutions, and what the asks are, and making the asks to the right people. So I started kind of gathering people and saying, this person really sounds like they know what they're talking about, but they're really angry. So let's all start meeting and let's channel how we're feeling into something productive. So we did. We started meeting at my house and introduced ourselves to the town council, who shook their finger in my face and told me I shouldn't use the word contamination. It was inflammatory language. And, it was the
It's inflammatory
fearmonger,
language. What do
crazy
you think it
lady.
does to someone's body?
Well,
Inflammation.
I was cooled. My colleague who co-founded with me was shrinking in her seat and anxiety was soaring. I could feel it off of her. And she becomes very diminished and she starts saying, I'm sorry, with her head almost down as they're wagging a finger and looking over the glasses. Me, I have a lot of conflict that comes into my office. In the real world, I don't like conflict. I cry. So, but in my office, I handle it, no problem. So I must have switched into that part of my brain. I looked him in the eye and I said, I don't really care for that word either, contamination. I love this town. I'm shocked over it. I said, but like it or not, it says on the state website, EPA designated contamination investigation. Do you know the very next day that was changed to the investigation into the presence of per and fluoroalkyl substances? So somebody called up the state and said, change that. Well, all of a sudden, we're not an EPA designated contamination investigation. And the EPA has been kept out of this by our state and they give reports and say they have it under control. Well, the polluter is running the show. So, what do you do about that? When you go to your town and they say it's not our job, people are angry at the water department. I protected the water department. They're my buddies. And that's unheard of across the nation. They're always the enemy. And I said, whoa, they followed the law. They feel personally really impacted by this. They served us water that had the best tasting award in New Hampshire. How betrayed do you think they feel? So they appreciate that because they were really stressful how they're going to deal with this. And, state legislators who were no help at that time. When we learned about this in early 2016, there were a couple of letters that were laid out what to expect. At that point, our governor was now our senator, Maggie Hassan, and Kelly Ayotte, who is our current governor, was our state senator for 2 years. I wasn't keen on everything she did as a senator. We disagreed on some things, but she wrote a letter and she said exactly what needed to be said about this topic. That November, Chris Sununu was elected as governor. Donald Trump was elected as president, and everything changed. The path we were on went behind closed doors and off record, and it was horrible. And people were, at that point, oh, he's part of the problem. And I'm saying we still have to engage. I did a lot of policy work under the first Trump administration. I went to DC many times. I engaged with the EPA. I worked with three other advocates in New England to create the first EPA listening session, which took place in New Hampshire and was duplicated across the nation. So what that was is the EPA came to each region and did this. It was 3 days long here with state officials, residents. We had panels of our own. We really did a good job modeling this, and other regions did not do it like we did, but that's okay. People had a chance to speak. And, out of that came the EPA action plan that you'll hear this administration talk about. We started it all. Well, guess what? Scott Pruitt was the first EPA minister under Trump. And everybody had plenty to say about him, right? But when he came out here, he looked us all in the eye and he made some promises at the end of those 3 days. And he committed to federal MCLs for 4 PFAS. And he put it all out there and it was all on record. And the following February, 2019, was published the PFAS action plan, of which I have a copy with to this day, all highlighted, and it's very pertinent. Nothing crossed the finish line and nothing was done. He was removed and Andrew Wheeler was put in his place. So he went from questionable to extremely in the pocket of industry. Michael Dorson was involved, Nancy Beck, who's back as chemical management person behind the scenes right now in this administration. And what we saw is people across the nation who found each other at a conference. I co-founded the National PFAS Contamination Coalition so we could all work together and address this federally. Because I'm a big believer that our government in this nation, to me, means a lot of things, but it should be at a minimum an equalizer, right? what my progress is in my community and how I got all the water filtered at our own expense, but it's all filtered to non-detect. The water department is my friend, not my enemy, and banded together people who never band together. Uh, because I can accomplish that, I can't just go home and go, whew, now I can go back to my life. I say, well, if I have this and this town doesn't have that and this state doesn't have that. So I've had, a dear friend of mine that I've made on this journey from South Side of Tucson, a amazingly beautiful, spirited Latino woman who has lost children to PFAS,
Oh,
really highly exposed community who just she has like a lot of faith and her religion keeps her going. So she's always blessing me and all kinds of stuff that I just go, thank you. And other people are going like this. And I go, hey, that's who she is. It's okay. So she's amazing. So that's what gives her strength. What gives me strength is the people, and just thinking about them, they're always in my heart. So, in working with her and other folks, when I introduced her one time in DC to my congressional, Congressman Pappas, I remember saying to him, you have heard me talk about Linda, and I have looked you in the eye since the day you took office and said, you aren't just working for me, you're doing a fabulous job as a leader in this issue, but you are working for Linda in Arizona because Linda doesn't have what I'm attaining here. And you were working for this person in South Carolina and this person in Florida who has none of this. So, and he's met a lot of my friends across the nation in the coalition, and he took that seriously. He was a founding member of the Congressional PFAS Task Force, and Lee Zeldin was a member of that. It was nonpartisan, and the goal was to gather the congressionals that represented the impacted communities across the nation because we were all linked and sharing information. We wanted them all linked and sharing information. So it was this dual idea that I kind of thought was pretty cool that we would kind of parallel each other. And I explained it to my congressionals. Somebody in Michigan explained it to her congressionals and a friend in Pennsylvania, and they all said, that's a great idea. So it was a bipartisan task force. They passed all the legislation that was a really good foundation to this. And you know what happened to it? I was taught in school that there's checks and balances, right? History class was really boring back in the day, but I remember some of it. And I thought that when a bill passed the House and went to the Senate, it gets presented, they discuss it, they debate it, sometimes they amend it, sometimes they compromise way too much, and then you keep going. You keep building on change incrementally. What I didn't know at that point is Mitch McConnell was the Senate Majority Leader. He gets all the bills in a pile on his desk, and if he decides they aren't going to get presented on the floor of the Senate, they don't get presented on the floor of the Senate. Isn't that an awful lot of power for one man who's taking marching orders from the president, clearly, who's basically saying, don't let that bill come to the floor because it's going to make me look bad. Because if it passes, and it would have passed if it went to the floor, because we had done that much work across the nation with congressional senators in the House, then what's he going to do? He would have to veto it, and it was a very bad look. So nothing got through for those 4 years other than anything that could be moved. Senator Shaheen was a tremendous help in the Senate Arms Committee. So the National Defense Act each year, they could attach things in that. And that was the only work in PFAS. It was mostly funding for DoD impacted sites and studies. Not enough, but that was the only PFAS policy that moved in those 4 years at all. In the EPA, they weren't working on this. They weren't allowed to. And I know people who work there. So along comes the Biden administration, right? So the coalition at that point has everybody who's focused on their little corner of the nation. And they have me who turned into this total policy not that I didn't ever think that I could ever do that. And I'm saying, here's what we have to do, on the policy front. And we have to pull out the asks that we have and what's in the PFAS Act. And we have to present this to the Biden administration and make our case. So we wrote this 22-point letter. And we did. We presented, this is who we are, this is our mission. And we got assurances that people working there said, you're right. We know this, and we're going to do this for you, and we're going to do this for the nation. And they worked in an unprecedented fashion to get the job done. And they did. They did.
okay. Back to your community in Maryland.
Yes.
And the plant, St. Cobans, is that what you said they're called?
Saint-Gobain, fabric coating. So what they do there is, if you're familiar or any of your viewers are familiar in London in the Y2K, they created this Millennial Dome, this big white ball next to the Eye of London along the Thames River, and you could go in there and see this amazing show that looked like a Cirque du Soleil show. And then they had all these exhibits and things like this. So Saint-Gobain acquired ChemFab just about then because ChemFab patented this fabric, which is a lightweight fiberglass infused fabric. It has to be strong and it has to be light. And then they saturate it and cook it in Teflon, basically. So this is what they do. They fabric coat fabric. So they dip it into dip pans. They send it up in rollers into these big air stacks and they cook it. And what they were doing there is they were not only cooking it, but they were cooking it too fast, too hot, and 24 hours a day. So they're spewing PFAS through the environment for miles through 13 unfiltered air stacks. And all we're hearing about is PFOA alone in water, whereas the EPA decides to do some research here in New Hampshire. They delivered the Office of Research and Development, ORD, which my understanding is they're all canned at this point. But what they did is they did some testing there. They found 190 PFAS coming out of those stacks at very high levels, and only 89 of them have chemical ID numbers. So I thought, whoa, there's more here that nobody's talking about. So at meetings from the very beginning, when they only talked about PFOA and Saint-Gobain only talked about PFOA, there I was at the microphone every time rattling off PH, HPA, PFDA, Gen X. There's a whole slew of them.
Call Gen
You
X very quickly. I know we're running out of time, but I was curious about Gen X in connection
Yes.
to this.
So Gen X is made in Chemours in North Carolina. And for many years, Saint-Gobainers heard me say this, and they weren't going to get away with this. I'd say what was made there is used here. And that's who made their trade secret confidential business information formula, Gen X. So part of the reason why they closed is everything is geared towards, oh, PFOA, we stopped using it in 2014, 2015. A, they didn't really, and B, the replacement chemical is Gen X. So Gen X is called HPFODA. It's a short chain PFAS, and it takes more than 3 times the amount of PFOA to get the job of PFOA done.
It has
So if
nothing
you
to do with
don't look for
Generation
it,
X, Gen X, the generation. That's nothing.
no, nothing to do with that. Yeah, it was almost like nobody was going to tell anybody what it was. Nobody even knew it was HPFODA for a while. So it was
Gen X
that
sounds
was their
better.
acronym for trade secret, basically, and nobody was supposed to know. So they kept that secret for quite a while. It was approved conditional use only in 2009 by the EPA with very severe restrictions, which haven't been followed by Saint-Gobain or Chemours when they make it. And I knew this. I had dug this up. So I would not let them talk only about PFOA. Let's talk about everything else that's in the water and it's in the air and it's on the site. And we're not okay. We're exposed as a class and we're only talking about one chemical. And other ones are there at very, very high levels. So that I never gave up on telling the whole story. So this is what happens here, and what's still happening is they give you this great story about the work that they're doing. And if you didn't know anything, you'd say, oh, that's really good. That's really important. But what I do over and over and over to everyone is I fill in the rest of the story. And then they go, oh. And I say to them, if you need proof of it, I can back up everything I say. Where do you want me to send documents? And then they don't know what to say. So, I can back up what I say. And it's been clear for many years.
How'd you get them shut down? And when was that?
Yeah, so last year, right after they were approved for a air emissions permit, they were on a temporary permit because we passed legislation. 3 women from my group went on to be state reps to get the job done in Concord and to educate the legislative body, the biggest one in the country, pretty much. And 3 of the dads from our group went on to be water commissioners to really work on making sure all the water was filtered to non-detect based on citizen petitions. So we were doing work on local, state, levels, working with the CDC for better guidance, so people didn't get treated the way we were treated, and many, many fronts. But policy in New Hampshire, we were one of the first states to pass water standards. The science at that point was a little higher than the EPA, 3 times as much. More science was there that they didn't review, and the EPA did review the rest of it. So we have water standards in the state, and then we passed an air emissions bill. It was amended and it was tied to water standards. So basically, they would reduce, not eliminate. And it was an 11th hour cheap trick by whoever's ass that was, definitely the bad players. So basically, the state, puts them on the first air permit for a year. Then they're watching and testing and doing all this stuff. And they're presenting this great information. And I'm saying, that's not true. This is the rest of the story. But I'm a social worker, right? So I found scientists across the country who are experts in this area, who came, who gave public comment, who could write citations and write it properly, and they had the right credentials. So now, unbelievable, right? So regardless of what technical comments we made on the hearing for the air permit, it came out that they had cheated, they had bypassed the technology, they had done things that were dishonest and deceptive. They had never been fined, they never lost a day of work, and they just call the shots. And calling them out in the media, calling them out absolutely everywhere, and bringing the truth. And the thing was, I realized after time, people trusted me and I had credibility. And they were realizing that they couldn't control the message. So, right before the decision to shut down, they had been granted a 5-year permit for their air stacks. And then shortly after that, people like, what? They just got what they asked. They never should have got that for 5 years. It should have been more restrictions 1 year at a time. But in the meantime, I had been really bringing the attention of the EPA at that time to the use of Gen X that was not being followed by I said, you have a powerful tool here. You have a guide that says you must not release more than 0.5% to the environment. You have to protect workers. You have to do this. You have to do this. Go there and look at the rest of the story. And I gave them documents that they didn't have for some reason because the state, no one gave it to them because the investigation was about PFOA alone. So the EPA paid them a couple visits. I spoke on record, and I think they realized that she's never going to go away. Some other
I
people
don't like PFAs forever. She's here forever.
persistent, right? Yeah, forever. So other people, when they got clean water and knew they were safe, how much can you take of this stuff? They just went back to their lives, but they always would say thank you so much because they knew there was more work to be done. So, we drove them out of town because we spoke with a French journalist who broke the story in France, and the shareholders were probably not happy because they had lied to the shareholders. So, they realized that the cat was out of the bag and people were never going to go away. And it was time to, cut their losses. They finished up contracts and they got out of the fabric coating business.
And I got to cut to the chase. I know we
And
just
that was that.
great story, and I hope other cities and municipalities and communities
Yes.
will learn from this and all the
Yeah.
details shared. Thank
Because
you.
you need laws, you need regulations to
Yeah.
back you up, right? You can't
Yeah.
just say you owe this to us.
So we have 2 minutes, and I have two questions, big questions. So do your best. We have an administration, Trump, that's back. RFK Jr. is taking his kids and grandkids swimming in a sewage dump. And then he says, don't take health advice from me. Okay, we won't, but what the hell are you doing as Health and Human
I
Services?
know.
The whole thing is
Crazy.
dysfunctional beyond belief. So what would you, I like to end conversations with what would you have us do under this? It hasn't even been a half year. The thought of 3.5 more years is toxic every day.
Absolutely.
So there's so much to fight for. There's so many rollbacks. There's so many outrages, especially the more we know, those who know, we're losing
Right.
sleep. And we've been trying to go fight an uphill battle, an epic challenge on
Yes.
all fronts, all shades
All
of
fronts.
climate being the great exacerbator. And then we have an administration that's not even pretending to be protecting public health or our
Right.
precious planet. What do you have to say that can be reality based, but yet encouraging?
This is encouraging because we can make progress here. We can do it very easily because we've done it in New Hampshire and we've done it. We are a PR nightmare to this administration, and that's kind of fun because they're doing a lot of harm. You're hearing the releases put out, the press releases by the EPA about how they're doing great work on PFAS and they have this whole plan and they're claiming all the progress is theirs. It's total BS. So what it comes down to is very simple. You don't have to know and rattle off all the acronyms that have gotten into my head at all. All you have to do is say your local government, your state representatives, your governors, have them all contact the EPA. And if they're Republicans, they can get in with Trump and let him know. Everybody has to, you can email, it's zeldin.lee@epa.gov. We can flood his mailbox, or you can tag him on social media and tag the president. And you can simply say, these chemicals do not belong in our drinking water. I refuse to drink this poison. That's it. We want it out. We want it regulated. No one is going to do the right thing just because, they should do this. It has to be regulated. We got into this mess because of a lack of regulations. So we need, our drinking water has to be safe. These are highly toxic substances.
Don't you love how Trump and Republicans, it's almost like, a memo went out 5 years ago or so, first Trump administration actually, where they would say, we're all for clean air and clean water, but they would never mention our climate, right? It was like code for beautiful air, beautiful water. You can hear the biggest, bestest, beautiful water and air. And they're not.
Yes.
I mean, it's bad enough that
Right.
they're afraid that it
No, they are
okay,
not environmental stewards.
but they're poisoning the air and the
They
water.
are.
So it is beyond hyperbole.
Fish, the
It's
food
criminal.
chain, the agri eggs, chickens, everything. Breast milk, if you have PFAS in your blood, you're passing it on to your infant when you're breastfeeding. I mean, how horrible is that? That's okay. And they're okay with saying, oh, we'll stick with the PFOA and PFOS, but we're gonna, slow walk it. You don't have to comply till 2031. Oh, great, pregnant moms. Just have at it until 2031. You will never get these chemicals out of your body when you have them, in your organs. If your blood levels drop, your organs will have them forever. They do not belong in our bodies, and you cannot make America healthy again if you're okay with people drinking known carcinogens in drinking water. There it is.
Me
It's the
with my
future.
granddaughter on
Grandchildren,
Monday, and my
yes.
daughter and her husband want another child. And I'm glad they didn't ask me because I want nothing more. I only have one daughter, then a couple of grandkids. But knowing what I know, I'm glad they didn't ask me for my opinion because I love this child
Yeah.
more than life.
When my younger daughter was pregnant and she said to me, so what are your thoughts about breastfeeding, knowing the background she's had? And she meant personally, not in general. And I thought to myself, okay, if she was a member of the public, I would give her some literature and some resources on this, but she's my daughter and I can't because she's going to be alarmed. I said, you have an amazing group of Boston doctors. I said, I think you can ask that question to your healthcare providers and follow their advice. I couldn't go there with my own daughter because she knows the work, but she hadn't lived here for quite some time. That was a horrible thing to have to stop and think about how I'm going to answer that because mammary tissue, breast cancer is 87% of cancers are environmentally caused, not related. And I learned that in the course of this work. That's a horrible statistic. If ever there was a reason to regulate the environment, because environmental health is what should drive environmental regulation, and environmental health is part of public health. And PFAS connects to climate change because they are a huge contributor, one of the largest, to ozone depletion.
And
So
as
it all connects.
I say, my programs are not for everyone, only those of you who eat, drink, or breathe. Everybody else go about your business,
Good
right?
point.
And
Yes.
it's crazy. So I think that Elizabeth Warren persisted, but I think you get the prize. And
Oh, I love her.
as someone who has been very tenacious trying to get my industry, broadcast news, to cover environmental solutions and have failed, I've knocked on every door, told them
Yes.
why they need a climate beat, et cetera, and they cover these issues. It's not one issue, minimally, and they think that's enough. So
They're
um,
always worrying about being sued, and it's ridiculous. If we're going to worry about being sued, who cares? Get sued,
we're
right?
gonna sue Fox for lying about climate change and other
Yes.
issues. That's who should be sued and stopped. Okay, I've got to say goodbye. Thank you
Right.
so much, Laurene.
Thank you so much.
really quite
Very
a
important
well,
topic.
and
Right. All right.
we'll spread the word about you, and please let people know about Code Green.
Yes. Take
A lot
care.
of
I
this is
will.
alarming.
All right.
That's
Bye-bye.
helpful. Thanks so much.